If you had to choose between three guys who help your team win in a variety of ways, who was going to get paid? How would you make that choice? Who would you give that money to? We're going to talk about that and more on this episode of Locked On Grizzlies. But first, let's celebrate the reality that myself and Damichael Cole are back together again. Damichael, how are you doing, buddy? It's good to see you.
What's going on, Joe? It's great to see you on the other side of the screen again as well, my friend. It's been a little while, but I mean we're getting closer and closer to what the fans are waiting on, what we are waiting on. Grizzlies training camp right around the corner. There are a bunch of storylines that we have to cover right here on Locked On Grizzlies, Joe.
That we are fortunate enough to cover here on Locked On Grizzlies. Very lucky to have that opportunity. Thank you very much for making Locked On Grizzlies your first listen every day. It is much appreciated. We are free and available wherever you get podcasts. The season is approaching. Damichael, I have had a chance to do a couple of solo shows now. And in my most recent episode that ran Monday, we had a conversation, myself and my wonderful screen, on the idea of themes for the season. One of the themes that didn't get mentioned that I know is going to be the subject of our conversation on this episode of Locked On Grizzlies is uncertainty about what this team is going to look like beyond this season. And there's three names in particular that really kind of stand out when it comes to that conversation in terms of contract extensions, two of which being unrestricted free agents. That means that they can leave Memphis at the end of the season, no fuss, no muss. And then there is one restricted free agent that has not yet signed an extension, who you would have thought maybe even once upon a time was a key cog of the Grizzlies core moving forward. Maybe not so much. Maybe they're waiting until camp opens to announce a nice big extension for him. But we've got three candidates to discuss in terms of prioritizing signing or re-signing. And I'm curious as to your take on them, and I know I'll get a chance to chime in as well. The first one is arguably the most popular, or maybe the most polarizing is a better way to put it. Mr. Dillon Brooks, who has been a Memphis Grizzlies mainstay since he was drafted in the second round in 2017. He is the last holdover from the true grit and grind when it was supposed to be Chandler Parsons, the bridge to a new era. He was that last guy. Even before Jaren Jackson Jr. showed up, he did get one extension already with this front office, but entering training camp, there is no extension on the table that we're aware of. I know this might be a question that you bring up in media day coming up in the days ahead as the season begins and training camp starts for the Memphis Grizzlies. But the future of Dillon Brooks, Damichael, that seems to be a good place as any to start when talking about the decisions this front office has to make.
Right, because he's the villain, right? You know, when I joined the beat, Joe, when I came back to Memphis, I knew Dillon Brooks was the villain because of how other teams perceived him. Every team pretty much that has a good defender has that villain, because good defenders are just annoying to opponents. Like, people don't like Patrick Beverley. People don't like Rudy Gobert. And, you know, all these really good defenders in the NBA. But the thing I realized with Dillon Brooks is he's sometimes a villain among the Memphis fan base too. And that's a little bit different, you know, with the shot selection and things like that. But I think one thing that Memphis and its fans appreciate about this guy is his passion, the passion he plays with. And that's why when you talk about the most polarizing, this is a guy throughout last season, a number of players. I can't even give you an exact number. Jaren Jackson, Ja Morant, the list goes on. These guys called him the heart and soul of the team. So we're talking about a guy who's just beyond, he takes too many shots. He needs to concede shots to Desmond Bane and Ja Morant and Jaren Jackson. We're talking about a guy who these guys respond well to. They listen to. He brings that grit, and we see it, Joe. The fans may not see it as much, but he challenges them. That's if you say, if Ja Morant takes a bad shot with 10 seconds left, who's going to be the one to say something to, Ja Morant? Dillon Brooks. No,
Somewhat ironic that he would be complaining about bad shots, but yes, you're correct.
yeah, exactly. But he's the one guy who will, I remember when Zion Williams first started coming onto the scene, and the fan base was all excited about his progression and things like that. And Dillon Brooks was like, well, he's doing all right, but we still need to work on him about moving his feet defensively. It's the little things like that. That's what you get with Dillon Brooks. And I think he's the guy who you let play this season out, because at the end of the day, I think, if the season goes well, if he plays well, there'll be an offer on the table for him. And if that's the case, I think he'll want to stay in Memphis, Joe.
I also think that it's important to point out that he's probably reached the Tony Allen realm of being more valuable to the Grizzlies than he is to any other franchise in terms of what he brings to the mentality, being that spirit animal that you kind of alluded to. That's very much true when it comes to the tenacity and the grit. So much of the culture that people like to wax nostalgic about already, even though it's only 3 years old with this franchise, comes from Dillon Brooks. Like John Morant gets credit for it, Jaren Jackson Jr., and maybe the vibes, so to speak, are beneficial in that way to Brooks, or excuse me, to Ja and Jaren, and even to a lesser extent Desmond Bane. Maybe they deserve some credit for that. But it's vastly important to understand that Dillon Brooks has made this team far more competitive and aggressive.
I agree. And it starts on defense. He's the guy. When you play Devin Booker, he's the guy you put on him. When you play, Stephen Curry, he was the guy who guards Stephen Curry the best, just from an eye test standpoint. He really made Stephen Curry work for his shots. And with all those other, the Paul George caliber scores, the Kawhi Leonards, the Anthony Edwards, that's the guy.
Karl Anthony Towns, you know what I mean? The versatility that I spoke about yesterday on the show.
Yeah, how about that? Even small ball for Dillon Brooks, getting it done against a guy like Karl Anthony Towns. So he's valuable, Joe. And I think before we rush to judgment, because I know there are a lot of people just basing it off of last season in so many games, Dillon Brooks at no point last season had an extended period of health where he could, whether it was the beginning of the season, whether it was him getting hurt again in January, and the latter part of the season. He never had a time period where it was like, this guy can play 30 straight games, healthy. And I think now he has a full off season under his belt. He was out there in Las Vegas. I saw him working out with the team out there as well. And now, back in Memphis, he's going to have the full preseason. I think this will be a big indicator of where he goes from here. And I think the Grizzlies don't have to rush to judgment on this one. Now, to the other hand, there are a couple more players we're going to talk about where they might have to do things faster. But, Joe, Dillon Brooks is more of the wait and see to me.
Dillon Brooks is a guy that you have the patience with because you understand that he really is important to what they're trying to do on the whole, right? Not just in terms of offense and creating his own shot, but defensively, he's so vital. All of that matters. What would you pay Dillon Brooks? What would your extension look like? Because he is coming off of a deal that was very team friendly. Seems unlikely that will continue moving forward in terms of that same kind of $12 to $13 million price range. He's probably due a raise. What say you, GM Cole? How would you handle the cash flow for Dillon Brooks in an extension?
Excuse me, I'm throwing on my GM hat real quick while I answer this question.
It looks good on you.
Have my GM hat on now. I think with Dillon Brooks, it's a wide range, because if he tanks offensively this year, you're still going to pay him for the great defense that he brings, and there's value always going to be there. If he has an offensive season that I think he'll have, which is he's still going to have those games where you feel like 5 of 18. Then he's going to have those games where he shoots 8 of 18 and makes some really big shots. I think you're looking at around $14 million a year, somewhere in that solid range. I think, again, two-way wings don't grow on trees. I say this all the time. Locked On Grizzlies viewers, you should be familiar with me saying this. To have a wing who can score on offense and play sound defensively, there's not a lot of them. It's only about, roughly 20 in the league, and that's a rough number. A lot of these guys we see are basically 3-and-D. They're just guys. They're going to make some 3-point shots wide open, and they're going to play defense. Dillon Brooks is the rare guy who can create his own shot, capable of taking over games. We saw Game 6, for better or for worse, he carried that team and was the reason they were alive going into that fourth quarter against Golden State. He has those moments, Joe, and that's why the range is so huge here. If he has a big bounce-back season, if he plays like Dillon Brooks from a couple seasons ago, you're going to open up the checkbook. We're talking about $16 million a year. So I think it was somewhere in the range of 16 and 11 per year is what Dillon Brooks is looking at. I don't think it'll have the long-term years as in the past. We're probably looking at a Tyus Jones, 2 to 3 years, somewhere in that range.
Yeah, I'm thinking 3 years, $17 million a year. That's what I'm leaning towards, because Tyus Jones is technically a reserve, right? He's technically a backup. So I think that you got to imagine Dillon Brooks will make a little more than that, somewhere in the 17 million per year range is what I would offer Dillon, because I think you and I are on the same page on how important he is, not just to the play on the floor, but to the culture off of it.
And then
you know what else?
One more thing. Yeah,
go ahead.
One more thing I wanted to add too. I said this in the past as well. Zaire Williams' progression is also a big indicator on that too. If Zaire Williams skyrockets, you won't feel as needed to pay him that money. If Zaire Williams has a sophomore slump type season, you need Dillon Brooks.
You do indeed need Dillon Brooks if Zaire takes a step back. You know what else you need as NBA season approaches? You need betonline.net. You might have noticed our nice, tidy little title banner there at the bottom of the show. Betonline.net is your number one source for all your pro and college football betting needs and sports info this season. Find all the latest football league developments, game matchups, news, podcasts, including this year's opening games. BetOnline is also your continued source for all sporting wagering information, including live betting, esports, the NBA, obviously. The fastest and easiest way to check in on all your favorite sports and events, including Major League Baseball, the NBA, MMA, boxing, golf, is betonline.net. Head to the website today or use your mobile device to learn more about the trends on this action. Again, that is BetOnline, where the game starts. So Dillon Brooks was our main focus in terms of extending, right? The guy that maybe makes the most sense to keep around in Memphis long term. Let's shift gears a little bit to somebody that many of us, or many folks that follow the team, thought was, and this is the technical term here, Damichael, washed. It is the technical term that is used when describing Steven Adams when he first arrived in Memphis. He just went on to have a career renaissance season and showed that he still could play the game in the NBA level at a high level, give or take being played off the floor against the Minnesota Timberwolves. And you could argue maybe he should have gotten more of an opportunity in that series than he did. He was an excellent passer, remarkable screener, fantastic on the boards as a rebounder. He did a lot of the dirty work that Jonas Valanciunas did with far less usage, allowing for John Morant and Desmond Bane and Jaren Jackson Jr. to have some success and grow their offensive games. He brought the same level of productivity as Valanciunas without the offensive output, which Memphis still no longer needed. The safety blanket could come off in the form of Valanciunas. So let me ask you this, Damichael. When you look at Steven Adams, not quite as clean of a fit in terms of the culture of the team. It's not to say he's a cancer by any stretch of the imagination. But when you think Memphis Grizzlies basketball and you think of the mentality that they bring, you don't necessarily think of the big Kiwi here. So does the odd fit of Steven Adams that worked really well last year, does that continue enough for the Grizzlies to consider extending him? Because when he first arrived in Memphis, that seemed impossible.
Yeah, it seemed impossible, right, Joe? But then he set a rebounding record. And then we saw this playmaking ability of his game where people was like, where did that come from? All these back cuts to Desmond Bane and, him and John Morant and this pick and roll duo that's just, unstoppable with these screens, and he shields the big man and Ja gets these open layups. It's like they really have something here. But what I learned about Steven Adams, Joe, more than anything this season was here, the mind. That guy, he could be a future coach, I think, if he wants.
He's an underrated basketball mind. I agree with that.
He really was one of those guys who, in media press conference, if you asked, he'll either shy away from answering something, saying, "Hey, look, if I answer that question, I'll have to get real nutty with basketball intelligence and things like that," or he just straight up tell you, and it's up to you if you figure it out or not. And at the end of the day, he's a basketball mind, and the guys respond well to him. I think he was very helpful to Jaren Jackson Jr. He's very helpful to Brandon Clarke, Xavier Tillman, and so forth. He's not the fit in terms of I've written about the Grizzlies and the Johnny Dang grills and their flair with NBA YoungBoy music and things like that. That's none of that. Steven Adams is the direct fit or linkage in terms of those culturally things that tie in a lot of this, this young group of players that the Grizzlies have. But overall, when they're on that court, all those guys fight for each other. I mean, we saw Steven Adams literally carry a 6'10", 250-pounder, away from John Morant. So at the end of the day, I think extension may not be the case here because of something we're going to talk about later, but he can play himself, into a return based on how he plays this season. I think sort of like Dillon Brooks, he's another guy, wait and see mode.
Wait and see. I agree to an extent. I think that for me, looking at the Grizzlies roster, they lack in bigger wings, right? Like Xavier Williams, you mentioned, his development so important to what they do moving forward. The Grizzlies don't lack in big men, right? Obviously, Jaren Jackson Jr., Brandon Clarke, who we may or may not be talking about in the final segment, Xavier Tillman, Santi Aldama. They have guys that can theoretically maybe not fill the exact role of Steven Adams, but they can slide into that position. At the very least, it gives them a little bit more, leverage in a potential negotiation with Steven Adams. I don't know that the Grizzlies need Adams. I know that he makes their lives a lot easier. Like, could Xavier Tillman be a good screener who throws the ball around as a passer and pay more attention to the rebounds? Yeah, I think he could be that. Is he going to do it as well as Steven Adams? Probably not. So you're having to replicate what he brings to the table in the aggregate, and that's a lot more difficult when it comes to a player as unique as Steven Adams. Again, I'll continue to bring it up throughout our season together, Damichael. He's able to do the things he does and help impact winning basketball games without taking offensive opportunity away from your three best players, Ja, Desmond, and Jaren. Because of that, I see him as a not invaluable piece because he's a big man. He was essentially, in some ways, given away by the New Orleans Pelicans. That trade was more so about matching money than it was anything else for the Pelicans. They wanted Valanciunas pretty badly, so much so that they gave up the lottery pick that became Xavier Williams. I am fascinated to see how they value Adams, who is a dying breed in the NBA in terms of contract. He's the elder statesman of the roster at this point. He's a guy who does not bring anything to the table from the perimeter as a scorer. But again, he does the dirty work that you need to be a winning team. So I think I'm a 2-year, $22 million mid-level exception kind of offer for Steven Adams. Certainly not Dillon Brooks money, but I think he's worth having a conversation about bringing back because of what he does to help accentuate the skill sets of a guy like John Morant in particular.
Yeah, for sure. I think you definitely have the conversation. And Joe, just going back to your point, so this is my thing with the big man. You mentioned a great point in terms of they have him. They have him for sure, but I'm just going to be completely honest here. Xavier Tillman, I think he's a sound player.
Sure.
But Xavier Tillman, I thought personally, didn't dominate Summer League. How, a third-year player who played a pretty, decent role on the Grizzlies.
Summer League.
Yeah, and he should dominate. Right? He should dominate. I mean, I think that's the type of player you expect to play so good, Joe.
Sure.
Where it's like, okay, 2 games, you don't need to be on the floor anymore. You're better than these guys. That's what I expected from him. But again, he brings sound things to the game. I think he's a really solid player. Santi Aldama, the book is, story's still being written. We have to see something this season in those games. Brandon Clarke, I like what Brandon Clarke brings to the table, but Taylor Jenkins doesn't like to start Brandon Clarke. He plays starter minutes, sometimes as we saw in the postseason, but overall, he's kind of been used as one of those, I like to think of him as like a third down running back, for our football fans out there. You have your big pounder, and then he brings this, quick, speedy guy in to throw, different looks. I think that's how Taylor Jenkins uses Brandon Clarke. So with that being said, I think there's actually a pretty solidified role here for Steven Adams, where this team, if he plays well and, they play well again and they look like a championship contender, you bring him back, no ifs, ands, buts about it. That rebounding, he's one of one. As we talked about the 2K ratings, right? 2K had him as the second best offensive rebounder in the NBA.
Right.
That is something I think that is warranted in that case. Brandon Clarke, really solid offensive rebounder as well. We saw Brandon Clarke's rebounding kind of, go away in that Golden State series. There wasn't a series I saw Steven Adams rebounding go away outside of being played off the floor against Minnesota. And Joe, newsflash, that won't happen again because this team in Minnesota now has Rudy Gobert. And Karl Anthony Towns. So as good as that move looks on paper, from the Grizzlies' perspective, now you don't have to take Steven Adams off the floor. So I think, there's a perfect scenario here where he could be the guy who returns. But, Joe, there might be another guy who could block that return.
That is true, and maybe it becomes a choice between the two. We'll talk more about that when we come back here on Locked On Grizzlies. All right, final segment here. We had a solid tease, as we call it in the business, the guy that maybe is seen as more long-term of a fit than an older, more veteran Steven Adams. Brandon Clarke. I know, Damichael, you talked about how when you're there at Media Day, you might ask a question or two of Zach Kleiman and company as to where a Brandon Clarke extension stands. There was a time where I would have conversations with folks in NBA circles, Damichael, back when I was running Grizzly Bear Blues over at SB Nation, and they would tell me that Brandon Clarke was the fourth or was the untouchable dude next to Ja and Jaren. Before Desmond Bane showed up, that was Brandon Clarke's seat at the table. And now he's been kind of pushed aside to the point where you even wonder where his fit is long-term. Now, Brandon Clarke does a ton of things well, very efficient scorer. He's kind of like a Zion Williamson light, if that makes sense. He's kind of like a Zion light. Certainly doesn't have the handle of Zion. He can't play point guard, obviously. But in terms of his ability to finish at the rim. And Clarke, ironically, was the second best player by PER in college basketball the season that Zion lost his mind and had all the success that he had. Brandon Clarke was number 2. So Clarke seems to me to be a guy that makes a lot of sense for the core of this team moving forward, even more so than Dillon Brooks and Steven Adams, arguably, but he hasn't been extended yet. Why is that, Damichael?
Now, this situation is different, right? Because this is a restricted free agent. So
right.
It could very well be a case where the Grizzlies are saying, hey, we want you back. This is where we value you. And but this is different from Steven Adams and, Dillon Brooks, because Brandon Clarke could say, theoretically speaking here, he could say, no, I want to play this out and prove, that I'm better than being paid like a top guy off of the bench or something like that. Mm-hmm. I think I'm a starting big man in this league. I'm going to prove it this season. Players do that. Some players, or it could be the other way around. He could be willing to take something, and the team could say, hey, first year looked amazing. Second year kind of, wasn't as good. People started to have questions. And then this past season, his third season, one of the more efficient players, not only on the Grizzlies, but in the NBA. Second most efficient floater among big men, only behind Nikola Jokic. So
which is impressive.
It's just very impressive. And you factor in, the defensive, ability, the versatility to put him in the game in the closing minutes when you don't want Steven Adams guarding, quick, agile point guards and things like that. He's valuable. Now the question becomes, does he bet on himself? Do the Grizzlies bet on him? Joe, I put my GM hat on already. It's your turn. Throw your GM hat on.
Let me see if I can find it. Hold on. Where's my GM? Up here it is. It's more of a fedora. Hold on. There you go. Look at that hairline there. My GM hat tells me that if I am prioritizing between Adams and Clarke, I'm signing Clarke. And I think that Clarke could be available for a similar MLE kind of number, $11 to $13 million. What Dillon Brooks signed a few years ago makes sense for Brandon Clarke, in my opinion. A 3-year, $39 million contract. I could see that making sense. It puts Clarke in a position where he hits free agency again around his prime, around 28 or so years old. And it also allows for him to see a substantial raise since he was a mid-20s first-round pick in the Ja Morant draft, which is crazy, right? Ja Morant and Brandon Clarke in the same draft. The Grizzlies killed that thing. I think that what limits Clarke is his inability to shoot the three. They need that if they're going to have Steven Adams out there. If Jaren Jackson Jr. is not going to be a legitimate threat long-term, the fact that you can't depend on Clarke to hit those long-range jumpers limits his value. But he is fantastic defensively. You mentioned that a moment ago. He and Jaren Jackson Jr. are a force. They need to get better at rebounding. But part of the reason they don't rebound as well is because they're out there on the perimeter, switching and defending guards and other perimeter wings. It makes it hard for a player to crash the boards coming in from 20 to 25 feet out. That matters too. Context is important when you judge the lack of glass eating from guys like Brandon Clarke. He is not a traditional big. He has some Sean Marion to his game. Again, not the ball handler, not that kind of guy, but in terms of his athleticism, his ability to get to the rim, and his most valuable skill is how he can defend positions 1 through 5 for any extent of time. He's not elite as a rim protector. He's not elite as an on-ball defender. He's above average, a jack of all trades. And because he can do that against multiple positions, it makes his fit within the schemes of the Grizzlies that much more important. So I would go with a mid-level exception deal. I'd extend Clarke. I'd extend Dillon Brooks. I think I'd say goodbye to Steven Adams if I had to. What say you, Damichael? We'll close on that.
I'll say first, before I get to that, I like you wearing this GM hat, Joe. We're gonna do this a lot more. It looks.
I do have
nice.
history as an armchair GM.
Yeah, and I'm pretty sure you won some championships off of that because
I'm 6 or 7 years running. I'm undefeated.
I'm picking up the Greg Popovich vibes. Zion Light, Brandon Clarke, Sean Marion. I like that Sean Marion comp as well because I see what you were doing with those. But with those players, I do agree. But I think based off what we've seen, I prioritize Brandon Clarke and Dillon Brooks as the two, as you mentioned. If push comes to shove, if you're saying, hey, which one of those guys, because we haven't mentioned it yet, but next summer, Desmond Bane, it's lurking.
He's going to make some money too.
He's going to get paid a pretty penny. I wouldn't hold my finger. I think $100 million is on the
Jaren-esque deal would be my estimate as well.
Yeah, and if he takes another jump, 20 points per game jump, I mean, who knows, Joe? It could push their hand a little bit. But with that being said, I think, the Grizzlies have said, Zach Kleiman has said, if they want to retain guys, there will be no financial holding back of doing that. We know we're going to want to retain Desmond Bane. If they want to retain these guys, based off Zach Kleiman has told us, they're going to do it. So I don't know if it'll come down to, hey, choose between A, B, or C. I think it's just going to come down to Brandon Clarke's going to have to agree to what they agree to. Basically, because we'll see. We'll find out more. We haven't had to talk to him about this more, but how does he view himself? The big thing that came out of last season was Tyus Jones saying, I view myself as a starter. Yes, I want to be a starter. People saw that and said, "Oh, he's gone. He's gone." Well, guess
And
what?
he's not.
He's back. He's back. So you let those things play out. But Joe, I'm thinking Brandon Clarke is the priority here because at the end of the day, the Grizzlies are the big men, other than Steven Adams, of course. A lot left to be proven for those guys. I think on the wing, you have, at least you drafted a first round guy in Jake LaRavia. You have Zaire Williams. If things go haywire with Dillon Brooks, you have options that'll be entering their third and second seasons who should be pretty good players.
Very true. I think you hit the nail on the head there. And that's one of the reasons they drafted the way they did, right? I think that John Morant, Jaren Jackson Jr., Desmond Bane, they are going to get the Golden State Warriors treatment. They're going to get paid. They're here to stay. I think beyond that, how the Grizzlies flirt with the luxury tax, I think they'll eventually pay it. The question is when will they be repeating payers? Those are all long-term questions that I'm sure that we can tackle on subsequent episodes of Locked On Grizzlies. Thanks again for making Locked On Grizzlies your first listen every day. Tomorrow, Damichael and I will be back again, chatting it up, talking about themes and storylines heading into Grizzlies training camp. Damichael obviously will be there on the ground covering media day for us and for the commercial appeal. I'm sure that there are all sorts of things that we'll be discussing in the lead up to that. Again, thanks for making Locked On Grizzlies your first listen. Now go and make the NBA Top 50 on Locked On NBA your second listen. I don't know if you've listened to this or not yet, Damichael. Some interesting Grizzlies tidbits on this list. And I was fortunate enough to have the chance to record some videos for this countdown. You're definitely going to want to check that out. Which player moves the betting lines the most this coming season? Locked On and the Bet Online odds makers present the NBA Top 50 most valuable players. Find it on Locked On NBA, wherever you get your podcasts, and on YouTube. For my wonderful co-host, Michael Cole, it's so good to have you back, buddy. Looking forward to a great season with you. Make sure you're sticking with us here on Locked On Grizzlies for all of your Grizzlies needs. There's plenty of great content out there about the Memphis Grizzlies. Just make sure you keep making Locked On Grizzlies your first stop. Until next time,